You're listening to the Virtual CISO podcast, a frank discussion providing the best information security advice and insights for security, IT, and business leaders. Welcome to the show.
Hey there, and welcome to yet another episode of the Virtual CISO podcast. With you, as always, John Verry, your host. And with me today is me. And for some reason, my screen's not working. There it is. I feel much better now. All right, so today's episode is an interesting episode. Last week, I was fortunate enough to attend a CMMC event in Washington, D.C., where we had a very good cross-section of people that are impacted by CMMC. We had folks from the DoD and NIST who were talking about it from that side of the fence. We had some C3POs. We had some key service providers, think Microsoft, Google, AWS, managed services provider in the space. We had a number of clients that were DIB members, right? Orgs that are subject to CMMC. So it was a great cross-section, and I think we got a lot of clarification with regards to CMMV2 and where this is all going. So I thought it was important to get this to you. So first and foremost, and I think the most important piece of news, is that according to Stacy Bosjanek, and she is at DoD, and she is effectively in charge of the CMMC program, March 2023 is the expected date when the rulemaking will be complete, which allows CMMC to be included in contracts. Those contracts would happen 60 days later, as I understand it, which means that we can expect to see CMMC actually appearing in contracts in May of 2023. So it's nice to actually have some clarification on when we expect this to happen. Now, it's important to understand that so now we're talking about CMMC V2, right? So level 2, which is what affects CUI, and level 1, which affects FCI. Both of those, we have the clarity on that. Level 3, by the way, is still a little uncertain. In level 3, we know that 800-172, which has 35 controls in it, a TBD number of controls, will form the basis of level 3. What's also interesting about level 3 is some clarification that we got, is that to get to a level 3, you will have a level 2 CMMC certification audit conducted by a C3PAO, assessment, shouldn't use the word audit. And then the DIBCAC will come in and do a level 3 assessment on top of that. Now, from a level 2 perspective, let's say we get to May 2023. In order for a contract to be awarded, minimally, you'd have to have a score in SPRS and or affirmation, your affirmation filed by your senior official. The affirmation is that new requirement that exists at this point in time. And then you can receive a contract for some period of time. There'll be a waiver process. What that will do is it'll give you a 180-day grace period to achieve certification, which is a very tight period to do so, which definitely puts contracts at risk. We know that we will be having C3PAO assessments at that time. For most contracts, there is that talk of bifurcation. The expectation is that eventually all contracts that are involving CUI will go through a full certification assessment. At the beginning, there may be some contracts that don't require that. The early adopter program has been approved, which means that you will soon start to see organizations touting the fact that they are CMMC certified based on the current version of CMMC. The expectation is they will need to get to 4,000 assessors in year 1 to be able to keep up with the demand. And the expectation is that they will have 8,000 assessors by the end of year 2, again, to meet that required demand. And the expectation, and the number that you hear pretty consistently, is there are probably 80,000 organizations that will require a CMMC Level 2 certification. Other points of emphasis that came out, there was a lot of talk, and I appreciated it because this has been my stance the entire time, is that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And realistically, with CMMC, nothing has changed once we rolled back to CMMC V2. because CMMC is effectively 800-171, and that went into effect December of 2017. So really, nothing's changed since December 2017. Those 110 controls that you've been attesting to the fact that you've implemented them by sending an invoice are now just being formally validated to be in place. And again, with minimal change, there are really just 4 documents that you need to pay significant attention to as you're working your way through this. We've got 800-171, which defines the 110 practices. We've got 800-171A, which defines how they're going to be assessed. So that allows you to know exactly what's going to happen and prepare your artifacts and evidence in a way which will hold up to that assessment. You've got 800-172, which we talked about, is if you're going towards level 3. That'll be the 35 additional controls or some logical subset of that. And the 800-172A document, again, is how it's going to be assessed. They reiterated, and I think it's important to talk about, that CMMC is expected to be a 3-year certification. So think of this as being like ISO, except in year 2 and year 3, instead of having a surveillance audit, you're going to have what they're referring to as affirmation from a senior company official. So if you guys are familiar with Sarbanes-Oxley, which had a management sign-off on the controls over financial reporting, this is ostensibly the same. So what we're going to require is a senior official is going to have a basis for his opinion, right? So some form of assessment, some evidence that he looks at and he says, I believe and I'm asserting to the fact that we are doing everything we're supposed to be doing. We'll talk why that's so important is the next thing here, which is the False Claims Act. So as you guys probably know, there's something called the False Claims Act. The government is really looking at this, and I think it's a key part of acting as an enforcement mechanism, during year 2 and year 3, or for those organizations that are not required, like under the level 1, right, the FCI. As you might know, last fall, the Justice Department launched their Civil Fraud Cyber Initiative. So what they did was they beefed up their capabilities to take on false claims acts. A false claim act can be triggered in a lot of different ways. Probably the most likely ways that you would end up in a false claim act would be a whistleblower or, and this is the scary part, some form of a cyber incident. So under CMMC, under DFAR's guidance, you are required to report security incidents. So if you have some type of a breach, you need to report that. If you have a breach, there would be the question as to whether or not, how did you have a breach if you've properly implemented those 110 controls? Of course, you can still have a breach with all of them implemented well, but it's less likely. So that might trigger some type of a review of what's going on. And if you are found to have misrepresented, quote unquote, the implementation of those 110 controls, you could be subject to a False Claims Act. These False Claims Acts can be very, very expensive. In 2020, they recovered over $20 billion through False Claims Acts. We just recently saw Aerojet. A claim was filed. They're a member of the DIB that was sealed for some reason, probably because it had something to do with some highly sensitive information. But CHS just had a False Claims Act settled in April-ish, I think, and that was about $930,000. So you do not want to be in that position. So it really is critical that if you are going to sign off that you have the proper implementation of your CMMC controls, I would strongly suggest that you actually do have it. Another point of emphasis was it is now okay with the clarity of CMMC v2 is you can get certified with a POAM. Now you can't get certified for POAMs for what we'll call high importance controls, things like multi-factor authentication or encryption. But for those controls that if you think about, those that have 1 point or maybe even 3 points, you can have a limited number of POAMs. It's important to note that you will have a maximum 180-day cure period on those if you do have any POAMs. Most of what I just gave you was feedback, what I'm going to call from the government and from those that are in the rulemaking side of the House. It was also really interesting for me to have a chance to talk with members of the community, other folks like us that do consulting, managed services providers, folks that provide technology services like Microsoft, C3PAOs that have gone through the process. And I thought some of the information that I got there would be worthwhile to share as well. One thing which is very interesting to me was talking with a C3PAO that has recently gone through their DIBCAC audit in order to become qualified as a C3PAO. And DIBCAC requested during the audit that they address the NFOs of 800-171 in an appendix of their SSP. Never seen that before. I thought it was really interesting. So the NFOs are in Appendix E of 800-171, and there's an implicit expectation that they're going to be there. So addressing the NFOs isn't necessarily hard. In fact, you probably address them by addressing the 110 controls. But this idea of explicitly pointing out in the appendix how you met the NFL controls was interesting and I think good guidance. Wouldn't take that long, but it does reduce that risk of it occurring during your assessment. Did talk to, unfortunately, a couple of folks that have had bad guidance during the process. So I talked to one in particular that was a painful process. They went with an RPO, a registered provider organization, that gave them some guidance that was incorrect. So they did a migration from on-prem Microsoft Exchange to Microsoft 365, not recognizing the fact that that would not be suitable for CUI. So now they're going to have to do another migration to Microsoft's GCC environment. So not good. Did speak not at the conference, but prior to the conference, I spoke with someone on the phone that had a similar challenge. They made some migration. They actually went to Microsoft's proper government offering. The problem happened was that the RPO did not understand that there is a difference between different types of CUI data and did not recognize that some of the data was subject to ITAR, which changes the cloud that it can be, and it's got to get to the GCC high, which is causing that organization a little bit of pain. So just a caveat and something to be aware of. Certifications are important, and an organization cannot provide services unless they're certified. I think it's equally as important, perhaps even more important, that they've got significant experience in dealing with these types of data, CUI, and have done work in the DIB. It is a relatively unique world to live in. One of the side conversations I got into was I sat down for lunch, and there was a couple of folks from members of the DIB that were pursuing CMMC or trying to figure out if they should pursue CMMC. And one of the guys was complaining that he knows that they're not fully 800-171 conforming, and he's worried that they're going to have an action against them. And he's worried, what's my liability? So we had a long conversation about that. And it was interesting because he has a friend who's left a company over the same, and he's considering leaving his company for the same reason. So interesting thing to be thinking about. Another thing which was interesting is I talked to a prime, and I also talked to a couple members of the DIB. And it appears as though the primes are going to be pushing hard for CMMC, ahead of the curve, if you will. One DIB member was telling me that they lost a contract. The quote was, 55 is too low a score for us to work with you. And then in talking with a prime, he basically said, we believe that a quote unquote certified supply chain is an advantage on the next, I think he used the term $1 trillion acquisition. I have a hard time thinking in trillion, so I'll use billion and assume that's what he meant. Of course, we all know the famous line from the senator, a billion here, a billion there. Pretty soon we're talking about a lot of money, so it probably was $1 trillion acquisition. Let's see, what else we got here? So that was really all the feedback that I wanted to share. And I hope that was helpful. And I think, with a lot of the conversations that ended up with DIB members and a lot of the people that I've spoken with over the last month or so on phone calls for, clients and potential clients, bottom line is, is we or is we ain't? You've got to look at the DIB as being, currently it's a get certified or get out kind of decision. Right. So, I've heard people say we're leaving the DIB. I've heard people say we are investing in the DIB, right? Because we're trying to gain market share from companies leaving. I've heard people say we believe that certification is a significant barrier to entry for new competitors. So it's a worthwhile investment because nobody is going to be able to come in and take our bread. So I think there's an is we or is we ain't a component here. And that's just your decision point. I don't think there's a right or a wrong. I think the fundamental question is, can you generate a reasonable return on investment for your business from your CMMC investment? If it's $100,000, if it's $150,000, you got to figure that out, and it's going to be a lot of money. It's expensive stuff, and I think there's one thing I missed on the previous slide there. Sorry about that. One other thing, which was another interesting point of feedback from the community, was the concept of flow down. There's increasingly an emphasis, both the primes and should be an emphasis in your organization, on what they refer to as disaggregating data and minimizing that flow of CUI down. One of the places where they pointed that out as being the most significant challenge, and something which was probably on the easier side to correct, is in not flowing down components of drawings that are unnecessary, right? Subsetting them out logically. So I thought that was interesting. Another thing which someone was talking about, where they had just gone through a DIBCAC audit, and the DIBCAC auditor said, "Hey, you've got your ERP solution scoped out, but you're putting the invoices into your ERP solution. The invoices have the part numbers, and those part numbers are CUI." So that's a really important caveat point, is to begin to try to get that information, as much information as we can, out of our ERP, because ERP pollution and cleaning that up would be a huge challenge. So again, back to that is we or is we ain't, and we talked about that. Is it a good investment? And then the last thing to kind of think about is that if you need to be in the DIB, and if you need to be CMMC certified, I'll just say that May of 2023 is a lot closer than you think. Generally speaking, implementing comprehensive cybersecurity programs like CMMC or NIST 800-171 usually takes most organizations 9 to 12 months if you don't want to terribly disrupt business as usual. So, and that assumes there's no backlogs, no challenges. So if you need to migrate to GovCloud, we know there are a limited number of providers. Right now, they can probably service you. In 6-9 months, probably not. There's going to be a line. Same thing with C3PAOs. So I would encourage you, if you are going to make the investment, I think you should make the investment on the sooner side rather than later side, so that we can make sure that we get you there, by May, June of next year. Of course, if you've got any additional questions, if there's anything we can ever do to help, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks, guys. Hope you found this one helpful.